Good afternoon. I am Deb Otis, Director of Research and Policy at FairVote. I am excited to have you here today to discuss the biggest ranked choice voting election of the year, New York City's ranked choice primaries, which occurred on June 24th. By all accounts, it was an election that showed the benefits of ranked choice in action. And I'm really excited to talk through all of this with our two panelists today. A couple of highlights that we have noticed. 96% of voters said ranked choice is simple. 76% said they want to keep or expand it to more elections. Turnout in this race was the highest since 1989. Because of ranked choice voting, 95% of all voters got to weigh in between the top two candidates in the mayoral race. We found once again, the city will maintain its majority women city council, something that had never happened before ranked choice voting. And lastly, we saw candidates cross-endorsing and collaborating and voters clearly responding to that kind of constructive and positive campaigning. So at the top lines, it looks really good, but today we are going to dive deeper. We're lucky to have two amazing panelists today. First, joining us, we have an amazing guest who deserves a lot of credit for how well ranked choice voting is working in New York City. And she can share an inside look at what it's looking like on the ground. Susan Lerner is with us today. Susan is the executive director of Common Cause New York, which led the ballot initiative campaign for ranked choice voting and the subsequent voter education and implementation efforts. She's been at Common Cause since 2007 and was the executive director of the California Clean Money campaign before that. Big welcome to Susan.
Thanks,
Our conversation today is also one for real election nerds. So we're going to dive into New York City's cast vote record. That's an anonymized record of all ballots cast in the primary that shows us how each voter used their rankings. This gives us tremendous insight. And so we are joined by FairVote's senior policy analyst, Rachel Hutchinson, an experienced researcher in the election reform space who will present those findings. Welcome to Rachel.
Thanks, Deb.
So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I hope you all are too. If you have questions, please go ahead and place them in the Q&A box. And if you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, you are welcome to do so. Say your name and where you're from. We are looking forward to hearing from all of you. So without further ado, let's dive in. Susan, can I kick it over to you first? Let's start at the beginning. What are the biggest takeaways that you've seen from this use of ranked choice voting this year?
So, Deb, you actually hit on it, which is we have been working at Common Cause New York and with our over 50 community-based partners in New York City to really be sure that voters understood ranked choice voting and used it, but also, importantly, the candidates took advantage of the various benefits of ranked choice voting and learned how to run a ranked choice voting election. And I think what we've seen, and the goal is to really try and limit divisive politics and create a new atmosphere of coalition politics. And I think the 2025 New York City primary really shows that that is an achievable goal with a ranked choice voting election. Of course, the high profile cross endorsement was in the mayoral primary. I think everybody knows that candidate Brad Lander, our current New York City comptroller, cross-endorsed with Zohran Mamdani. But even before that, the Working Families Party cross-endorsed. They didn't rank their initial endorsement, but they said there are 4 candidates that their supporters should be looking to. And they really helped the candidates collaborate and share their common policy approaches, which is one of the, to provide more information to the voters. And of course, what we saw is similar cross endorsements in various city council races. So we're seeing more candidates who understand ranked choice voting, who are talking to candidates and who are talking to other candidates and to voters. And we're seeing broad-based community support. As I said, a coalition of over 50 community-based organizations working day in and day out in different languages with cultural competency to explain RCV to their voters. And I think the high level of voter satisfaction and the solid turnout numbers show that that effort is paying off.
Amazing. Thanks, Susan. If you don't mind going back in time a little further, voters voted to adopt this back in 2019. What were the problems that folks were trying to solve back then by bringing ranked choice voting to the city?
So, it's interesting. I had a conversation earlier today with a colleague about how there are different ways to do ranked choice voting. And so you need to identify what specific issues you're trying to address in your jurisdiction. In New York City, because we have a very robust campaign finance system, we provide a high level of public financing to community-based candidates. We have the privilege as New York City voters of having really crowded fields, particularly when a race in office is term limited. So in 2021, we had 36 council members who had been termed out. It's a huge number of new candidates, and it's not unusual to have anywhere from 4 to sometimes 12 or 13 candidates running in a primary for the same office. And in New York City, we are a heavily Democratic registration predominant city. And often it's the Democratic primary that's the really contested race. So we were concerned that it's very hard for the voters to make sense of these very rich candidate fields, and that RCV was a good way to help voters make choices and understand how to make sense of a crowded field. The other thing we were concerned about is the extraordinary cost of runoff elections in a large jurisdiction like New York City. In 2009, there was a runoff election for our public advocate, which is the third ranked citywide election. The runoff election cost $11 million, and the total budget for that office was $5 million. So it seems like we were a bit out of whack. And in a highly competitive but polarized political situation, we were concerned that we would see more and more runoffs. And that cost factor was also very important to us. And so those were the two things that we really highlighted in the process of convincing a charter revision commission, which was the third charter revision commission we talked to about RCV, to place RCV on the ballot in 2019. That's what we talked to voters about, explaining that RCV really gives voters more power and more choices. And the voters heard the message and adopted RCV. We were then lucky enough to have support from various funders locally and nationally to be able to run a really robust education campaign in 2021. We were able to translate explanatory materials about RCV into 13 different languages. We hosted over 600 presentations online and in person about RCV in the course of a year. And we were able to work with, as I said, a broad selection of community partners in virtually every single ethnic and neighborhood community in New York City to really help voters understand about RCV. And we worked closely with the city to ensure that the ballot language, the ballot itself, the educational materials, and the city education effort was accurate and used the same terminology that we were using in explaining RCV to the community. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of coordination and uniformity of messaging. And it paid off.
Amazing. And I love how you framed the issue of having so many candidates running as a privilege. It's nice to have this active political culture where folks want to throw their hat in the ring. They want to connect with voters and run for office. I think it's a really good problem to have. We saw that in 2021 and in 2025. And now that we've seen both of those election cycles, Susan, I wonder if you have any other insights about what has changed from 2021 until now.
So I think there's a better understanding of RCV from the candidate's point of view, from the campaign and endorsers organization's point of view. You know, at Common Cause New York, we not only do voter education for RCV, but we also do candidate and campaign worker education, which we offer at no cost to all of the candidates and campaigns running in ranked choice voting elections, really basing on a model that FairVote Minnesota has really, I think, developed. And what we saw was a better understanding of RCV, a willingness to talk to voters about RCV, and more endorsing organizations that ranked their endorsements, which is another way in which the voters get the message. And interestingly enough, there was a very successful high profile campaign, which in all honesty, originally we were like, we're not sure about this, but we learned was actually very helpful. And that was a campaign that explained to the voters that they should not rank a high profile candidate who shall go unmentioned on this call, who people did not want to see in office. So it allowed us to talk in more detail with voters about how they need to think about RCV. And it isn't just, here's who I want. In this instance, it was, if there is somebody you do not want to have in office, it's not, oh, well, they're my last choice, I'm going to rank them fifth. It's, you only rank the people you actually want to see in office. And I think that clarifying message came through loud and clear and was helpful to the voters, because we were hearing, well, I don't like this one, so I'm going to put him or her fifth. And we were able to say no. The thing about ranked choice voting is it allows you to vote for the candidates you really want to see in office, from the ones you are passionate about to the ones who you think are acceptable, but you don't rank somebody who you don't want to see in office. And I think that that also improved voters' understanding of how RCV works.
That totally makes sense. Thanks. I'd like to throw it over to Rachel now. So Susan and I, we touched on turnout, polling, women's representation. Rachel, can you dive into those results a little bit more and really show us some of those numbers? Show us what that is looking like?
Yes, I sure can, and I'll put up some slides while I do that. Okay, so like you said, we've been tracking things like representation, turnout, voter satisfaction for a couple of cycles now, and we can see that the impact of ranked choice voting is not only good, but it's enduring. So I'm going to start with polling. Deb already walked through the specific statistics earlier, but just to reiterate, you can see that super majorities of voters like and want to keep ranked choice voting, but also that that's consistent with what voters said when they were asked the same exact questions in 2021, the first time around. To move to turnout in 2021, when ranked choice voting was used for the first time, there was historically high turnout, the highest since the 80s. And in 2025, New Yorkers outdid themselves again. Turnout breached 1 million in the Democratic mayoral primary, the first time that's happened since the 1980s. This chart doesn't look at every factor that can affect turnout. Of course, many things can, but our theory is generally that RCV makes campaigns more positive, more competitive, and allows more votes to count in a way that meaningfully impacts the results. So that might be what's drawing more voters to the polls. The New York Times also did an interesting analysis. They broke out turnout by age group. So we saw a big spike in voters in their 20s and 30s turning out compared to last time. Next, I'll talk a little bit about women's representation. So because most council districts are safely Republican or Democrat, knowing who won each primary gives us a pretty good idea of who's going to win in November. So currently, there's 31 women on track to win council seats in November. That's actually the same number as it was in 2023 and 2021, 2021 being the first time RCV was used. That was also the first majority female council. So you could say there's just something magic about the number 31, but looking at this chart from our friends at Represent Women, we can see that's actually a big difference over what the council used to look like pre-RCV. The reason that happens, again, according to research from Represent Women, is that women can run without splitting votes. This year, I think it was the District 8 Democratic primary was an interesting example. A majority of voters had voted for a female candidate, but the vote was split between two of them. And so ranked choice voting allowed them to consolidate support in a later round. And ranked choice voting also reduces incentives for negative campaigning, which also can disproportionately hurt women. So go ahead, Miss Susan.
I was going to say, we see that in how the campaigns are actually run. And it is something which cross-endorsed candidates, and I think women candidates, have an easier time saying positive things about each other for whatever cultural reason. But, when we train campaigns, we tell the campaign workers that RCV is the beginning of the conversation, that when you hit a voter who isn't already aligned, has another choice than your candidate, that's not the end of the conversation. That's the beginning of the conversation. and that you talk about the way in which your candidate's policies align with the voter's choice and ask them to rank. It's a very different approach. And as we've seen, women candidates in New York City have really adopted that.
Absolutely. So with that, I'm going to dive a little deeper into the data and talk a bit about the cast vote record. So as Deb mentioned earlier, the cast vote record, it's an anonymous digital representation of all ballots. So we can see not only who voters' first choices were, but also their second, their third, their fourth. And we can run all sorts of analyses that give us deeper insight into voter preferences than single choice voting can. So stuff like how many preferences did people have, which candidates had overlapping support. So I'll start with a few interesting high-level things that we can tell from the cast vote record. First, there's this concept called the Condorcet winner. In political science, it's basically a name for the candidate who would beat everyone else in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup. We figure this out by looking at each pair of candidates in a particular race and saying what percent of voters ranked X candidate higher and what percent ranked Y candidate higher. And so using that data, we can see that across every single race, the candidate who was preferred head-to-head versus all their competitors was ultimately the winner. We also figured out that across all of the contested primaries, an average of 74% of voters ranked a winning candidate in their top three. This is a metric we call consensus value. Basically, it means for 3/4 of folks, they either saw their first choice win, if not their second or their third. We also looked at how many more votes counted because of RCV, meaning how many folks did not rank a front runner first, but they were able to weigh in with a backup choice. And the answer is almost 250,000 across all races that went to a tabulation. That represents a 26% increase compared to if everyone's vote just counted for their first choice, aka single choice voting. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the marquee race at the top of the ballot, the Democratic mayoral primary. First, here we have a round by round table. This shows each candidate's vote share in each round. Here we just highlight the top 6 candidates. So that comes out to round 7 through 11. And we can see that Zohran Mamdani led in each round, including the first. But as candidates were eliminated, he further consolidated support, which makes a lot of sense given the ways he was politically aligned with a lot of the candidates in the top 6, as we're going to explore a little bit more later. I mentioned earlier how we can use the cast vote record data to look at how the candidates fared head-to-head. Here we have a table looking at the pairwise comparisons between the top 4 candidates. So this particular chart reads across rows. So if we're looking at the top row, Zohran Mamdani, he was preferred, 56% of voters preferred Mamdani to Andrew Cuomo, 75% preferred Mamdani to Adrian Adams. In fact, a majority preferred Mamdani to every other candidate, which makes him the Condorcet winner. Also, another interesting thing is that a majority of voters preferred opponents Brad Lander and Adrian Adams to Andrew Cuomo. Sorry, just getting to the next slide here. So we also looked at ranking patterns depending on who your first choice is. So this chart reads, of people who ranked Zohran Mamdani first, what percent ranked one or several backup choices? And we can see that for almost every single candidate, over 70% of their voters ranked a backup choice. 80 to 90% was actually more common. The one exception was Andrew Cuomo. Of his supporters, only 55% ranked a backup choice, but it being a lower figure than the others isn't necessarily a bad thing. He was one of the front runners, and if your favorite candidate is a front runner, you probably don't need a backup choice. It also makes sense given he didn't really encourage voters to rank backup choices in the way some of the other candidates did. He did share on election day that he only ranked himself. That said, the fact that a majority of his voters ranked a backup choice anyways is pretty interesting. Nonetheless, compare that to Mamdani and Lander, who very publicly said that they were going to rank each other number 2. And over 90% of their supporters did choose to rank backup choices. Focusing again on the Cuomo voters for a second here, we took this analysis and ran it a different way. We looked at New York State Assembly districts. So in each district, we found what percent of voters ranked Cuomo first and what percent of voters ranked only one candidate. And there was a really strong relationship between these two variables, which indicates Andrew Cuomo's supporters generally followed his cue. So Susan, I'm curious if you can share some insight on how different campaigns approached RCV and how you're seeing that reflected in this data.
Well, the data I think are really clear. And frankly, we saw the same patterns in an analysis of the 21 data, which is voters are very candidate responsive. It's one of the reasons why in our candidate and campaign training, we ask people, what do we as RCV advocates call the candidate who tells people to bullet vote only them, just to rank them as number one? And we tell them we call them a loser, because they have no way, if they haven't hit 50%, above 50% on the first round, the candidate who does not have their voters rank and does not want to be a second or third choice to some voters has no way to accumulate a consensus majority through the rounds. And that's why Andrew Cuomo was able to concede, surprisingly, on primary election night, because he knew that he had so few voters who had ranked him second or third, because he told them not to, that he had no way to actually accumulate a consensus majority. So, it's a pretty clear message. We see it occasionally that candidates make the mistake of saying, oh, don't bother ranked choice voting. It won't do anything for you. And 9 times out of 10, they are the losers. So we train candidates and campaigns to urge people to rank. If you're not going to rank me number one, rank me 2 or 3. And if you've seen the cross endorsement video between Brad Lander and Zoran Mamdani, it's pretty cute because they both come out and say, rank him number 2, right? Nobody says rank me number 1. They say rank him number 2, and the other guy says rank him number 2. But the message gets across to the voters that this is a ranking situation. And I think it's as important to say rank me in the top 1 to 3 as it is. It's certainly more important to say that than it is to say, I'm your choice, only rank me. And we saw that repeatedly in races throughout the city.
Exactly. So with that, we're going to dive even deeper into the use of rankings and how the campaigns encourage voters to use those rankings. So getting back to the slides here. Voters used their rankings most when it mattered was something we noticed, and perhaps that was a little bit due to messaging from campaigns and organizations. So, for example, of voters whose first choice was not a front runner in the mayoral primary, so their favorite candidate wasn't Mamdani or Cuomo, nearly all of them, 92% to be exact, did rank a backup choice. So it kind of shows voters, they get the logic. If they know they'll probably need a backup choice, they're probably going to give one. The Dream campaign was a coalition that encouraged voters to rank 5 progressive candidates. And the data suggests that this worked pretty well. Of their slate of endorsed candidates, there was significant overlap between them. So 76% of voters who ranked a slate member first did rank another slate member second. And 70% of those who ranked Lander or Adams or Myrie or Blake first had their vote count for Mamdani in the final round. The New York Times also did an interesting analysis where they looked at the most popular first, second, third, fourth, fifth choices by area. And the most popular backup choices, Brad Lander, Adrian Adams, Zellner Myrie, and Michael Blake, were pretty consistent across the city, and they were also endorsees of that Dream campaign. So voters not only listened to cues from the candidates, but also from organizations. We're highlighting the Dream campaign here, but there were tons of other local political organizations, unions that released their own set of ranked endorsements. And this kind of thing really serves as a useful cue for voters. It gives them a sense of which candidates are ideologically aligned. And speaking of, as was mentioned earlier, the most noteworthy alliance in this race was probably between Zoran Mamdani and Brad Lander, who cross-endorsed each other in a video. And there's pretty strong evidence that voters listened to this. 65% of Mamdani's voters ranked Brad Lander second, which is particularly interesting because if you were his supporter, you didn't necessarily need a backup choice. He was the front runner, but people still followed his cue anyways, which just goes to show how important candidate messaging can be. And we did have reciprocal support from the Lander camp. A majority of his supporters did rank Mamdani second or third. So next, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit from the mayoral campaign and see what the data shows about how much and how effectively voters use their rankings. So as we talked about, voters generally use the opportunity to rank, but we can also use cast vote record data to analyze whether there were differences among any demographic group. So specifically what we did here is look at each New York State Assembly district and find the average number of rankings used there, and then the racial composition, as well as statistics on income and education. So this allows us to test relationships like, was a higher Latino population associated with a higher average number of rankings used, or things like that. And by analyzing all of these factors together, the model controls for each variable. So basically what we did is estimate the relationship between each demographic characteristic and ranking behavior while holding all other factors constant. We did this for the 3 citywide Democratic primaries. This sort of gives us the most data points to look at across the city. So getting into the results, we found that in the mayoral primary, assembly districts with higher shares of Latino residents ranked more candidates on average. In the public advocate and in the comptroller primaries, districts with higher shares of Black, Latino, and Asian residents ranked more on average. All of that's controlling for income and education. This doesn't mean that the groups I didn't mention ranked fewer candidates. It just means that the relationship wasn't significant. The only variable that was associated with ranking fewer candidates was the share of the population with a high school education or less in the mayoral primary. So we decided to dig a little deeper into that because ranking fewer candidates, like as we said earlier, isn't inherently a bad thing, especially if your preferred candidate is a front runner. So we ran another regression model to see if the share of the population that is high school educated or less was associated with whether their ballot counted for one of the final candidates. And that relationship was actually positive, meaning having less education was a strong predictor of being more likely to have your vote count for Mamdani or Cuomo. And that tracks logically. If you have one of them on your ballot, especially higher up, you're less likely to need backup choices and more likely to see your vote count in the final round. One other thing we looked at is error rates. So this is measured in terms of a first round overvote. Basically means a voter ranked 2 candidates first. That's the only type of error that's comparable to single choice elections, and it's the only one that invalidates a ballot entirely. So the mean error rate across all of the ranked choice voting elections was 0.2%. That's down from what it was in 2023. And it's also on par with RCV error election rates across the country. And it's also on par with what we saw in single choice elections on the same ballot. So we looked at the choose one races for judge of the civil court. There were Democratic primaries in Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. And when we look at RCV and non-RCV races with similar numbers of candidates, the vote rates tends to be pretty similar. So there were 2 single choice races with 2 candidates, and they saw error rates of 0.3% and 0.5%. And in comparable RCV races, the average was 0.4%. There was 1 single choice race with 4 candidates, and the error rate was 0.3%, and that's the same exact average error rate we get when we look across the RCV races with 4 candidates. So for a bit of context, across all races, RCV led to a 10% increase in ballots counting for a finalist candidate. That's 50 times the rate of ballot error here. It would be even higher if we just counted races that went to an RCV tabulation. So to put a bow on what all of the data says, the big themes that emerged were voters take advantage of the opportunity to rank, they respond to cues from their favorite candidates, and also factors like the competitiveness of the race. And finally, of course, that RCV helped more of them weigh in between top choices. So I'll throw it back to Susan. I'm curious what this data tells you about voter and candidate education efforts in New York City, and what other cities and states across the country might learn from you as they work to implement RCV.
So, I think what this shows is that a community-based education effort is indeed effective across all communities, working with partners in the different communities who are on the ground, talking day in and day out to their voters and their community members is absolutely essential. And as I said, we were lucky enough to have the resources to translate into significant numbers of languages and to work with culturally competent organizers as well as community partners to be sure that the word got out. But we think of RCV education as a 3-legged stool. First, you have to have education from the jurisdiction. None of us are ever going to have the resources and the modalities that communicate with every single voter. So working with New York City, with the Board of Elections and the Campaign Finance Board, to be sure that there were clear instructions at polling places, that the mail that the voters received has a clear, understandable explanation of RCV was key. And of course, in 2021, we were lucky that the city actually did TV advertising, and we absolutely knew when the TV ads hit, because when we were handing out lit on the street, voters would, people would say to us, "Oh yeah, I saw that on TV." And we hadn't heard that the week before. So the jurisdiction is extremely important. I can't overemphasize how satisfying it is to work with the community partners, how much you learn about what voters understand and don't understand, and how to continue to refine and clarify your message, because as I've said, the uniformity of the message is extremely important. But trying to translate ranked choice voting into 13 different languages, just the term itself requires a cultural competency and a willingness to transcreate, because there's no direct analogy in most other non-English languages. So the community partners are key. And finally, as I've said over and over again, working with the campaigns, one, so that they understand how to run a ranked choice voting campaign, because it's a tool like any election reform that works for whomever understands and uses it, but also because more than any of the rest of us, it's the campaigns that are talking to voters day in and day out. And what we say to the campaigns is, you are providing relevant information to the voter. This is not taking you off message. When you explain to the voter that they have choices and how an RCV election works, you've made a direct connection with the voter that creates a positive impression of your campaign and your candidate, irrespective of their issue positions, and that you shouldn't give up that ability to communicate with the voters. And we've seen some candidates do terrific explainers on their websites and in their lit that were very linguistically and culturally competent, and really helped boost their voters' understanding of RCV. So you need all three parts for an effective implementation plan. And, we are, as I said, lucky in New York to have great community partners and have had the resources to support that effort.
Well, I'm convinced that this went well and that this works for voters, delivered better elections. But let's look forward a little bit at what's next. We had two audience questions about what's going on in November. So these elections in New York were just the primaries. And so now we have party nominees, but that's only step one. So is ranked choice going to be used in the general election in a few months? And what do the prospects look like?
So it's not going to be used in the general, because when we first started talking about RCV for New York City, we were grappling with a peculiarity of New York State's ballot. New York is what we call a fusion voting state. That means that the same candidate can be endorsed by different parties. Now, there are 3 states in our country that use fusion voting. The other 2 set up their ballots so that the candidate name appears, and then under the candidate, any endorsing parties. New York is different. Remember, we were the home of Tammany Hall. So New York arranges its ballots in columns based on party, which means that if a candidate is a fusion candidate endorsed by more than one party, like the Democratic Party and the Working Families Party, or the Republican Party and the Conservative Party, that candidate's name would appear twice on the same ballot. And when we were setting up RCV, it seemed to us that it was going to be overly complicated to explain RCV and then convince voters not to rank the same candidate more than once if they appeared on the ballot more than once. And so we at Common Cause New York have said, let's get through 2 mayoral primaries. Let's see how RCV works in the primary. And then let's decide, have a community discussion, should we extend it to the general, now that we know voters and candidates are comfortable with it and they won't get confused by a fusion candidate. And so we're beginning that community discussion now to see if we should expand RCV to the general. but it's not in place in 2025 for the general.
What about other cities in New York State? Are there prospects to expand ranked choice to other locations in the state?
Absolutely. There's real interest in a number of different jurisdictions, with the one that comes right to mind being Buffalo, New York. Buffalo actually is just started a charter revision process. They literally have not reformed or changed their charter from top to bottom since the 30s. So it's going to be a lengthy process. And there's a very solid base of community support for RCV in Buffalo, and we're working with partners on the ground. There is interest in other areas, but I would say that the one that's moving most quickly is Buffalo because of the Charter Revision Commission. And of course,
Exciting.
we want to, we'll be continuing to talk about RCV throughout the state, just to be sure that people understand how it works and to dispel any mis or disinformation about how well it works in a multi-ethnic setting.
Wonderful. I'm also seeing a couple of questions specifically about overvotes. So I might kick this first one to Rachel. Jay in the Q&A asks, can you say more on why first round overvotes, as opposed to overvotes in any round, are the right comparison to overvotes in choose one elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you make an error that disqualifies your ballot in a later round, which I should start by saying is a very, very, very small amount of ballots. So it could be something like an overvote in a later round. You could skip a ranking or repeat a ranking. I'll say, first of all, doing one of those things doesn't automatically invalidate your ballot. Like if you skip up to 2 candidates, it'll count your next choice. But the reason that things that happen in a later round aren't really comparable to single choice voting is because under single choice, it's not possible to express preferences beyond your first, and therefore not possible to make errors in doing that. So if your vote is active in any round beyond the first, you've already had more say than you would have under a single choice election, even if you make an error later on.
Awesome. The other error question we got, maybe we'll start with Susan for this one. Someone found in 2021 that some areas of the city had higher rates of ballot error than others. We found that this is true in choose one elections, and this is true in ranked choice elections. Some of these disparities exist. And so this question from David is whether there were changes in the voter education plan to target specific areas of the city and how that worked out.
Yes, yes. First of all, the first thing that we did was we went back into the charter and we simplified the language explaining RCV on the ballot. There was pretty good language that the Charter Revision Commission had incorporated into the charter revision, but as these things go, of course, it was written by lawyers, and it was pretty clear. It wasn't bad, but we knew that we could make it simpler and clearer. So the first thing that we did after 2021 was go to the council and say, hey, we want to clarify the language. We want it to be simpler. And we also passed a revision which improved the physical design of the ballot. Okay. So, there are a lot of different factors. How you lay out the ballot can influence the error rate. And we worked with the Center for Civic Design to clarify, because there were already some requirements in the charter, but we added requirements to ensure that the ranked choice voting contests were clearer and grouped in a way that distinguished contest from contest, and ensured that the very limited number of non-ranked choice contests were clearly delimited by design elements, by how you lay out the ballot, where you put the lines, the thickness of the lines between the different contests, and just basically basic design principles to clarify and improve an already pretty good ballot, but make it even stronger. And of course, we did an analysis of where we felt of what the record showed with FairVote and with our partners at CUNY Mapping Center to see where there were gaps, and emphasized reaching out to those communities, working with our community partners, ensuring that there were linguistically and culturally competent materials, and that the partners had the opportunity to really have a good lead up to the primary and concentrate in those areas. While we did not have the same resources to do as deep a citywide education program. So we were very definitely deliberate in honing in on the areas where we felt the 2021 record said they could use some more help.
Awesome. I love to see this kind of iterative process. When New York City releases this detailed data, it lets folks find all of these insights, and then the city and outside groups kind of know where to target additional voter education efforts. It's great to see the transparency when they choose to release this full level of data. It helps everybody. And so we really commend the choice to release this cast vote record that helps us identify this stuff and all of these interesting insights.
Yeah, I mean, we had wanted to actually get to the digital images and to do some additional analysis, but there are restrictive statutes in New York that keep us from doing that in a timely basis. And we haven't had a chance to go back and look at 2021 now that it's available.
So we'll pivot to another question in the Q&A here from Jeff. One of the things that I always think is the most exciting aspect of ranked choice voting is that you could potentially have one of these come from behind winners, where the person leading in the first round ends up not going on to win in the final round. Jeff asks, did that happen in any of the races this year?
It did not in 2025. It did in 2021. In 2021, in a city council race, actually in Harlem, there was a young African-American woman who was in, I think, the second or third place on the first two rounds, and she ultimately was the winner.
All right, I've got another juicy one. We talked about some of these coalitions that formed and how a lot of voters seemed to be listening to that, kind of ranking these candidates that were in the same coalition. Skip asks, oops, I'm sorry. No, this is the wrong question. No, this is great. We're going to get to Skip's. You're next, bud. Sorry. This question is whether we saw anybody ranking kind of outside of those coalitions. How much crossover did you see between different factions within the Democratic candidates?
You know, there was such a well-organized cross endorsement at the mayoral level that we did not see a real breakout difference. Of course, you know, the unions ranked differently. It was not monolithic, but because the more progressive coalition attempt started early on, which frankly we endorsed when we talked to our endorsing organizations, our message is do not wait until the day before the primary to cross endorse. Figure this out sooner so the voters have enough time. And so it was a fairly steady ramp up that began actually in late April, early May to really get the word out. So, you know, cross endorsements at the council level, definitely. But on the, there were one or two attempts to cross endorse, actually, as I think about it, in the mayor's race, and they did not really catch fire. There was one candidate who surprisingly stood up and endorsed Andrew Cuomo, and he did not return the favor. And then there was another candidate who really did not do well in the ultimate rankings, who tried to cross endorse and it wasn't successful.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a bunch more audience questions that we are still going through, so keep those questions coming. We have plenty more, but probably space for a few more. Next is a question from Skip. Skip says, it seems like the shift to coalition politics and the rise of engagement are byproducts of ranked choice voting. And I think the data today showed that. So Skip asks, why isn't this a major story in the media? Mamdani's win is widely discussed, but it seems like ranked choice voting is not as much. What do you think?
Well, I think there has been some coverage. There was a piece in, I think it was I'm trying to remember which publication now. I'm blanking on which one. I think in the New Republic, there was really good coverage in the Washington Post about the way in which ranked choice voting actually played out. And actually, in the New York Times, we've seen a repeated series of articles doing pretty deep dives with maps and different rounds and really explaining how ranked choice voting played out in the real world in the mayor's race. And so I think it's really a question of which publications you're looking at. There has been a pretty extensive analysis of how ranked choice voting ended up working, at least among New York publications. And we can fight with the New York Times as to whether they think they're a New York publication or not.
Great. Okay. I have another one from Claude. Maybe I might kick this to Rachel. Claude says, it seems like you might be better off as a candidate having another candidate in your same lane. Rachel, do you think that's true? And from the data, does it help to be a candidate on your own or to be a candidate in a coalition?
I think it depends on the kind of race we're talking about. So if you're a candidate who has all of the name recognition in the world and ran a great energized campaign and you have majority support outright, that can certainly be enough to win you the race. But if there are other competitors in your field who sort of come from your ideological lane, that can also be a good thing, especially if you don't have majority support outright, because it gives you the chance to say, hey, I am this kind of coalition builder type candidate. Watch me be civil to this other opponent I have in this really polarized climate we have. So it sort of depends on the nature of the race, what sort of name recognition you're looking at. But I would definitely say it can be a good opportunity to have other candidates in your lane to like show what kind of a coalition builder you could be.
Okay, awesome. I have a voter privacy question too. Someone has asked that some people say that cast vote records could invade on voter privacy. Is there any merit to that? And what is New York City doing to make sure that they can share this data and be transparent without violating privacy?
Rachel, is that for you or for me?
You go ahead.
Either one.
Okay, so the way in which it could invade privacy is in precincts, which we call election districts in New York, where you have a very, very low turnout. And there have been revisions made so that the cast vote record for low turnout districts are aggregated together so that you can't say, oh, well, since there are only 6 people who voted, we're going to try and figure out, who the 6, who voted which way. And so there are steps that are taken to ensure that the data is truly anonymized where it needs to accumulate.
Awesome. We really appreciate the election administrators who are trying to find the correct balance between transparency and protecting privacy.
And I do want to say that the process of this entire endeavor, that we've really worked closely with the New York City Board of Elections. I know they often get knocked. We've seen them really work through RCV and become, over the time that we've been working on this project with them, much more professionalized body that we really enjoy working with.
Amazing. So another exciting ranked choice race coming up this year is the Minneapolis mayor's race. We have a question in the Q&A from Jean from Minnesota, who says there's a lot of comparing the New York City outcome to the Minneapolis upcoming mayor's race, where there's a Somali candidate who is a DSA candidate. And so there are these comparisons with Mamdani in New York. And Jean asks, what insights and lessons would you share with the Minneapolis community based on your New York experience?
Well, first of all, we modeled a lot of our education. Jean, thank you for being part of this discussion on the things that we learned from Minneapolis. I think there's a really great back and forth. And again, it's really working at the community level with partners, supporting partners, knowing what they need and helping them develop the materials and the uniform messaging that is culturally and linguistically competent.
Awesome, thank you. I also have a question from Michael in the Q&A here. Michael says that they have watched ranked choice voting get voted down in a couple of places recently. Michael wonders if some of those no votes might come from disagreements over the specific policy. They highlight that some places have tried to combine ranked choice with open primaries, whereas in New York City it is just primaries, and other places kind of have it for primaries and generals. And they are curious, the panelists' thoughts on these different policy preferences and how you make that choice. I'd love to hear from both Susan and Rachel on this one.
Let's start with Rachel.
Sure. So like you said, ranked choice voting comes in a lot of flavors. You can use it within a partisan primary to make sure you're nominating strong candidates for the general. You can use it in a general election to sort of avoid the spoiler effect, all sorts of things like that. So I think one thing that kind of ends up being decisive in whether a ballot measure or legislation goes forward is that ranked choice voting is solving a problem that's very specific to the jurisdiction. So like in New York, Susan talked about it earlier, there was the problem of these expensive runoffs and these crowded candidate fields. When Maine, before they implemented ranked choice voting statewide, they had someone who won the race for governor with under 50% several times. So it was like solving a very specific problem there. So I think that may account for varying levels of failure and success when it comes to advancing legislation. And yes, people do have different opinions about like the accompanying reforms that sometimes are paired with ranked choice voting, whether it's open primaries or something like that. I'll pass it to Susan.
So I would say start with your community,
Yeah.
not with your reform. Okay. I mean, going back, as Rachel pointed out, as Deb asked, what's the problem you're solving for? Is RCV the right reform that you should be talking about? And be sure that you are having a broad-based, community-based conversation before you're trying to advance a particular reform. It's a problem that we've seen, unfortunately. If you don't have a broad base of support, it is a lot harder to effectively adopt a reform. And it's a lot easier for there to be misinformation about how the reform works and who it and what its benefits and its shortcomings are, because there's no perfect system, friends. We know this. Every system has shortcomings. So you have to be straightforward. You have to really know your jurisdiction, and you have to pick a reform, including a version of RCV that works for the problems you are trying to address. Because we don't have, and I've gotten this question from activists, can you send me the model RCV revision? No, I can't, because there's no off the rack version that we can guarantee will work in your particular situation. We need to have a conversation about what you're trying to achieve, what are the communities that are most active, and how to develop the right details of RCV for your particular jurisdiction. So start with your community, not with your reform.
These are good words of wisdom on how to choose your policy. Thank you to both of you. I will add, FairVote does have model language for off-the-shelf ranked choice implementation, but we always recommend, exactly as Susan says, that you make sure you're tailoring it to your own location. And so treat it like a starting point. And we would love to have a conversation about how to adapt it so it works well in your location. And so we have time for just one more question. There's a question I've been seeing a lot of variations on in the Q&A, and it's, where do we go next? How do we adopt this in more places? And a couple of people have specifically asked about presidential elections. I'm so sorry to be talking about that 3 years before the next presidential election, but here we are. It's on people's minds. And so for me, ranked choice voting and its growth is one of the things that makes me optimistic, because I see folks working on this and able to achieve this, bringing it to their cities and states, and it's having a positive impact like we saw from New York City. So I would love for each of our panelists to leave us with some wisdom about how we can expand, where we can go next, and what's going to be the most effective way to grow this movement. Susan first.
So I feel like a broken record, aging myself, that I'm a repeating record, and that is start with the community and start with education. Don't come in with a solution before you've defined the problem and before you've educated your potential partners. Start with an open-ended exploration. What is this? How does it work? Who are the people in other places that like it? Bring in elected officials, bring in community activists, sponsor forums, answer questions. Don't come in with, and now we're going to introduce this to everybody because it's the best thing since sliced bread. Start with education and make it community-based.
I'll pretty much echo that. I think the most effective way to start is to start locally, trying to get this passed in your own city or town, not only because it's a more manageable task, but because it paves the way for maybe a statewide measure down the road. You know, when people are considering doing things at the state or federal level, their first question is always, oh, well, where else have people done this? And has it been successful? And what does the data say? So getting this adopted in your own local jurisdiction, whether by collecting signatures or lobbying your local city councils, is a great way to start. That said, I'll say something on the contrary now related to presidential primaries. People are certainly already talking about 2028, and we can expect crowded fields on both sides. So I think that will create a really interesting opening for people to be talking about ranked choice voting at the federal level too. So it's possible to, you know, have both lanes going at once.
Sounds great. Thank you both. We are about out of time today, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you to Susan and Rachel. This has been a really great discussion. I appreciate the insights that both of you bring to this work. I encourage our audience members to continue to follow Common Cause New York. It's doing really wonderful work. And then, of course, stay tuned for more from FairVote. Rachel will be co-authoring a report on New York City that will be coming out this fall, and it'll have all of these stats and even more new analysis. So stay tuned for that. Big thank you to the whole audience for spending this hour with us, for being so engaged. Really great questions coming in from the Q&A, and so it was great to hear from you all today. Over at FairVote, we will plan to post this video on our YouTube and social channels in the coming day, so share this around with your friends who might have missed it, or watch it again if you'd like, and keep an eye out for other future videos and events. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks again for being here. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.